Greetings and konnichiwa, and welcome to the Onyx Tavern. I'm your host, Rick the Barkeep, bringing you podcast 108 here at the Tavern, presented by Hirotaku.com. Patrons of the Tavern, you are in for a special treat today, and I don't mean that sarcastically, because we have one of our favorites here at the Tavern. Raptor is back, ladies and gentlemen. How you doing, Raptor?
I'm doing wonderful. I spent the evening training a Bowser amiibo in Smash Bros. Before Barkeep hit me up and asked me if I wanted to podcast, so
It's
good
nice.
night.
Yeah, it's nice to know that you're using your time constructively.
Hey man, I work 60 hours a week. Let me have my time off.
I work no hours a week right now, so. But Raptor, the reason I wanted to bring you in is that I found a question on Facebook that I thought was kind of interesting, and I think it's worth exploring other than a question of the day format, which is how it was presented. There is a Facebook page that I've gone to a couple of times called Power Rangers versus Super Sentai, and they're like most of the pages just post facts and clips and things that'll come up in Power Rangers news. But they do have a question of a day segment, which it's ranging from your favorite Red Ranger, favorite Megazord, and what season, and all that kind of stuff. But I thought this was a very interesting question they posted last week on their page, and I'm going to read it verbatim. Do you think you would enjoy a military-themed Power Rangers or Super Sentai show? Now, Raptor, the reason I want to bring this up is on face value, I think a lot of people look at this question as aesthetically military. Wouldn't you agree that people who asked this question and people that were responding were things like Power Rangers with tank Zords or helicopter Zords or fighter jets? That seems to be what you would normally think. Is that not true?
Yeah, that's what I would think. The image, and I'm assuming that you're going to put this image up on the video. The image makes that a bit misleading by using army camo. But yes, I think that I think that's their actual question. I don't think they're proposing U.S. Army funded Power Rangers or JSDF funded Super Sentai.
Absolutely. And the thing is that the reason I bring this question up is because I think it does open kind of a can of worms of what if this was to go ahead and happen in both the context of Power Rangers and Super Sentai. And I do want to kind of address first what we've had in both Sentai and Power Rangers in terms of some sort of military or paramilitary force. People who have seen the earlier Sentais up into the up into the 70s, kind of mid 80s, will know that hey, Super Sentai has basically been military characters. The Go Ranger, 5 military officers that survived an onslaught. Battle Fever J's fighting a terrorist syndicate through use of the military. And I think the last military series we had was O-Ranger in 1996, which was 1995, which was deliberately meant to mimic the military Sentai of the 70s and 80s.
And you can make the argument for Go Busters being military-esque, but not full-on military themed like our Ranger was.
Absolutely, and this brings up an interesting point. Let's first of all remind everybody that Japan really doesn't have a military, say, in the way that the United States does. Of course, when MacArthur got in there and built the Constitution and stuff, part of it was they couldn't have an offensive fighting force, but they did give the concession that they could have a defensive force in the JDF, as we've established.
Yeah, the self-defense forces, which mostly exist to be smashed by Godzilla.
Absolutely. And of course, throughout Sentai it's been present, but, as we pointed out, it's gotten a little bit more sci-fi when it got into the 80s, and then full-on fantasy with Zoo Ranger. And again, they pretty much abandoned the whole kind of military concept, and really that died with O-Ranger and the way that real-world events played out within the series. Because again, it was meant to be the dark, gritty military Sentai of the 80s, but then the real world had to intrude, and unfortunately, well, it just didn't work out for that particular show.
Yeah, Gritty, dark military Sentai is not the best thing to have on TV when a terrorist gas bombing kills dozens in the Tokyo subway.
Absolutely, and that's where this goes into, I think, where the deeper context of it, because I don't think Power Rangers or Sentai can or should be GI Joe, or any type of whatever the military shows are this kind of day. Because Raptor, the whole point I kind of thought about when I heard this was how much of a propaganda tool and how improper it would be for Power Rangers to be military themed, in the sense that the Rangers are the military, they are funded by a government, and they have military based vehicles. I know there's been a lot of controversy with the film American Sniper. I know there's controversy with the real world events of us pulling out of the Middle East and with ISIS and all that kind of stuff. And I frankly feel that it would be improper to have a series like that. Let me get your thoughts on this before I kind of go in a little bit more detail on mine.
Well, when you say funded by a government organization, I don't think that's going into bad territory, but yeah, when you if you were to directly if you were to have a ranger team that is directly affiliated with a specific branch of the military, or even all of them, because hey, you could have the Army Zord and the Navy Zord
And let me kind of be clear, and what I'm specifically kind of getting into is that if it's a Power Ranger show, it's a U.S. themed cast, even though it's filmed in New Zealand, but it would be like the Power Rangers funded by the U.S. government. That's kind of what I was getting to.
Yeah, although they would probably only ever say government, they probably wouldn't ever make reference to the U.S. government. It's just the government. Usually the highest ranked official you'll ever see is the team's mentor.
I wouldn't necessarily believe that, and again, I'll get into kind of more my thoughts on it, but I just want your general thoughts. I mean, if you heard that they were going to adapt a Sentai that was military themed, that was kind of like what was in the 70s and 80s, into a full-fledged Power Rangers U.S. Army Rangers or Power Ranger Army Rangers, whatever you want to call it, what would be your kind of thoughts about that?
Well, it would, at that point, I suppose it would depend on execution. If it was turned into, if it was kept at a minimum and kept at, if it was not turned into too much of a Top Gun recruitment commercial series, I would be fine with it. But if it started going into that territory, I would take issue with such a series. I think that would be, I think that's, and think what you want about whether or not joining the military is a good thing. I think that that's something that shouldn't be pushed on kids from a young age to encourage them to do that. That's a decision that I think should be made by an individual when they reach adulthood. So I think that could be a dangerous road to walk down if it was too close to reality. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and that's pretty much my fear in the situation, because now whether the U.S. Army or the military or the government, whatever, would get involved with this production, I mean, keep in mind, when Michael Bay does a Transformers movie, he gets full help from the Army and the U.S. Navy, as long as he kind of like glorifies the Army within the film, basically. Whether they would get involved with Power Rangers is a debate, of course, but I would look at it that if you were to have something based on military presence, and you are going to set in modern day the United States, it could definitely be used as a propaganda tool, and that's what kind of worries me. I mean, you can take a show like, say, G.I. Joe from the 80s and say that was propaganda, but you have to admit that G.I. Joe was in a different era than it is now. 30 years after the fact, war in the 1980s is not war nowadays. And I think that's where it also gets into even more of a troubling kind of territory, because we always have a separation in Power Rangers between the military and the Rangers themselves. Now, typically they are part of a police force, vigilante group, or wherever Lightspeed Rescue is. I know people are going to bring up Lightspeed Rescue, but this gets to my main point of who they are fighting. And I did a video on Power Rangers versus humans and the more implications of that previously. But if they did an Army-themed Power Rangers series, who would be the villains of that? Because I don't think... Yeah, I mean...
keep going.
Because here's the thing, is that, you can have alien invasions, you can have demons from another dimension, all that kind of stuff. We've seen that kind of stuff before. But if it's a full-fledged, they're all from different branches of the Army, built, by the government, whatever and stuff, taking place in the United States, you would have to question, would they get involved in terrorist conflicts, Middle Eastern conflicts, World War, whatever that situation may be? You would almost, I would say, have to have a terrorist organization like Cobra, like ISIS or something like that involved for these Rangers to go ahead and fight. Do you agree with that, or what do you think?
I think that producers would probably think having a military aesthetic would be controversial, or possibly controversial enough, and that they would probably try to veer away from a real world enemy as much as they could. Because U.S. Army versus aliens is not as controversial as U.S. Army versus Middle Eastern terrorists in a kid's show.
And to go back to the Transformers discussion there, the Army's always fighting against the Decepticons in the film. We never have the U.S. Army fighting against another country, just the Decepticons. So that's a way for Michael Bay to glorify the military without showing, I guess you would say, the darker aspects of it. And let me take this opportunity, Raptor, real quick to point out to everybody, and I probably should have done this earlier, that I'm a military brat myself. My father was in the Army for 20 years, served in Desert Storm, so I've been around the military. I know people in the military, and I got a pretty much anti-war, hippie, beatnik kind of stance and all that. So I'm not going to be blind to the issues of the Army and what people believe in stuff, but I just want to go ahead and point out that it's just not appropriate in the climate that we're in and mixing Power Rangers into that. Because you also have to bring up the question that, if the Power Rangers are fighting all these monsters and stuff, how come they don't get involved with things like ISIS and Kim Jong-un and all that kind of stuff? But when you have a show like this, you have to directly answer those questions, and that kind of takes Power Rangers into a realm where it doesn't necessarily belong. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. See, I think that there's a certain assumption when it comes to kid shows that kid shows are not allowed to take sides in the same way that a primetime television show could, because kid shows are seen as directly influencing youth, and when you start putting very controversial ideas, all right, perfect example. You will see a lot of depictions of same-sex couples or just gay or lesbian characters in primetime TV. You'll see them in things like Glee, you'll see them in sitcoms, but you will never see them in a kids show. The first, you get like implications of it in things like Adventure Time and The Legend of Korra.
Or SpongeBob.
Yeah. And I believe it would be the same principle with putting a down-to-earth, realistically depicted U.S. military-based Power Rangers series in. You could get, all of a sudden you'd be walking into accusations that it's, pro-war jingoism, or it's a recruitment commercial, or maybe it would swing in the other direction. Maybe it could end up having people say that it's offensive to the military or it's disgraceful to the military. And
Yeah, and to that point, I've had a number of people over the years say that things like superheroes and Power Rangers are disrespectful to the actual military and actual police officers and stuff like that. To which I'm just like, it's a television show. I mean, even I recognize that.
well,
Yeah.
perhaps Power Rangers is a good example of that, more so than say than other
Well,
superheroes, if not just for the giant monster aspect.
well, I mean, look at it this way: Power Rangers SPD is more respectful to the police than Reno 911.
Okay, yeah, I'll give you that.
Yeah, but and to that, look at SPD. They are police officers, but what exactly do they do besides fight Grum that's police work? Because I don't see them really petty theft, arson, or murder.
Hey, they do detective work.
Barely. I mean, they're not like Sherlock Holmes or anything like that. I mean, or I'd sell for Lucy Liu, but you get my point. But I mean, it's like in SPD.
Well, remember back in the Mighty Morphin days, how long was it before we ever saw a police officer?
Third season when Bulk and Skull joined the junior police department. But according to Linkara, it would have been, I think, Turbo, maybe? Or I'm trying to remember.
Okay, Ray. Or was it?
It was till the fifth season, was till Turbo that we saw military. And that, of course, brings up, the question of, what is the military doing in Power Rangers? Because, as we'll point out in Godzilla films and all that, the military, Japan, defense, whatever, is always coming to stop Godzilla in futile efforts, of course, before some other monster, some other force, takes over and stuff. Rarely do we see that in Power Rangers, and the closest we did get was to the Rame tank, but that was, of course, private, sector and all that kind of stuff, which Time Force could have touched on that with Mr. Collins, but never really followed up on that.
And that's actually a good example to bring up because that is the closest thing that Power Rangers has had to a civilian fighting force, well, just a human fighting force that engages with the monsters and threats that the Rangers usually protect people from.
True, and the Silver Guardians were private security. And I think that was also something that was put in there to distinguish them because, when you look at the entire history of Power Rangers, there's nothing to really indicate that they're ever attached to any type of specific military. Because, again, Lightspeed Rescue, that was a division made just to fight the demons. And obviously rescue operations, so I wouldn't call that a military. The GSA had soldiers, yes, but I would count that as a defense force as well. We haven't seen a full-fledged...
It was Commander Mitchell? What is...
Captain Mitchell.
Captain Mitchell. I need to check the... Because Capt, isn't that a rank in several different branches of the military?
I know it's a naval rank, and I do believe it's a rank in the Air Force.
Yeah, so that's something that, again,
we've had those ranks. We've had Captain Mitchell, General McKnight, Commander Staton, Commander Kruger. We've had all those different types of ranks, but I would argue that they're military in the same way that Starfleet viewed itself in the 1960s and the first few seasons of Next Generation, where they didn't look at themselves as an army. And of course, that was really stemmed from the culture of the writers, the 60s peace movement, the anti-Vietnam stuff in the 1970s, and all that. And that, when you think about Power Rangers, that whoever you're going to get to write, even if you get a third grader to write, they're going to have to put some sort of parallel or some sort of commentary in there. No matter what film or television show you see that depicts the military in some way, they do take some sort of stance on that, whether that is Forrest Gump, American Sniper, or Transformers. There is some sort of viewpoint that's put in there. And, Hollywood is, I guess, liberal, as you would call it, and Power Rangers is a kid's show, but you have to kind of wonder what would the writers have to say in this kind of show with this platform. Somebody's going to take the opportunity to say something, and I wonder what that is.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about times that we have had references to specific branches of the military. I can think of two. You may be able to think of more.
Well, I know
But
Taylor was in the Air Force.
yeah, Taylor was in the Air Force, and as was Scott in RPM.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we can debate about Scott's what Air Force Scott was in because of the alternate dimension,
But
but
I think the thing we don't need we can't lose sight of here is that again the villains they were facing were robots in
right.
RPM
But
and yeah.
let me finish what I was going to say
Oh,
about
sure,
the characters.
sure. Go ahead.
The characters are portrayed as very upstanding, all around good people, good role models.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't say that they're being disrespectful towards soldiers. However, their military service is not referenced often with either.
With Taylor, it's barely at all. It was only reference on how she actually met or how found her way to the Animarium.
Yeah, and how she went AWOL, which that'll be an interesting thing to deal with when she returns to civilian society.
Well, she never did deal with it in the final episode.
Yeah, she's kind of like there, but yeah. And Scott, however, he joins Dr. K in the RPM crew while his father takes over defense of Corinth.
Yeah, the Colonel Truman. Yeah. Which, I'm going to have to say real quick here, I wouldn't necessarily say that Scott is always depicted as a positive character, and that's simply because of his daddy issues going on. So Taylor only has, like, her anger as a fault, but Scott has this as part of his entire character, trying to appease his father and avenge his brother.
He has some daddy issues, but I wouldn't say he's a bad role model. I wouldn't say he's someone
and that's probably too poor choice of words on my part.
Yeah, I wouldn't look at him and say that this character is a poor representation of servicemen.
But I wonder if the thing I have a problem with, and you helped me on my junior film where we kind of dealt with this issue, is that not everybody in the military is an upstanding citizen. That you do get jerks that get into the army and things happen, which was my whole point. And the thing is, I think that if you do go the route of Power Rangers military force and all that, I think that's something that has to be addressed, because one of the best things that they have done with some Power Ranger seasons is that they've kind of thrown off that goody two-shoes thing and put characters who would not necessarily be in there, like Dylan from RPM. As we establish, he's kind of a loner. We know he's part cyborg and all that. He's not the kind of person you would typically look as a Power Ranger, nor a character like Ziggy. And I hate to be harping on RPM, but that's a good example right there. And I would almost imagine that if you did this Power Rangers military thing, you would have to have the washout of the academy, the guy with the attitude, or any number of Hollywood cliches that you want to go ahead and use. And you might have somebody in there that should not be in that particular situation to offer that type of commentary, which would be a smart thing to do. But whether it should be done on Power Rangers, that's,
Perhaps there is, I don't
want to see it where if they had this, that all 5 Rangers that they get are the paragons of virtue that we had back into Mighty Morphin. Because then, to me, that becomes propaganda. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, and I think what this ultimately comes down to is how close you bring it to the real world. The more it starts to resemble the real world, the real military, the real goings-on in today's world, the more of a chance there is that you can offend someone or make someone else angry.
And there's nothing wrong with that in media. I mean, the point of film and television, all that, is for you to think about such things. But in the medium of Power Rangers, which I concede is a children's show, there are other messages to convey within that type of context, and messages of the military need to be conveyed in other forms of media, whether that be primetime television or feature film.
I would put it this way: if you wanted to have an anti-war message in Power Rangers, you don't have to do it by having a depiction of a jingoistic army. You can just have themes of peace and pacifism. But, or if you wanted to do a pro-military series, you can instead focus on themes of valor and honor and sticking with your comrades. You can engage kids with those same ideas without having to
turn into a U.S. Army commercial.
Exactly.
Which, again, that would be my fears if the Army starts funding it, which means we would get better actors and better production values, but at what cost, I guess. I mean, look at the Transformer movies. I mean, yeah, we got the budget for it, and we got help from the Army to get the coolest new tank in there, but at what cost to the actual film? Excuse me. And I should also point out to everybody that, again, this was just a question. This is likely not going to happen because, Raptor, two things. One, I believe the days of the military Sentai are dead at this point, and they died with the first 8 episodes of O Ranger and what was going on there. And second of all, I just don't think that Japan would do a series like that nowadays because of the aforementioned reasons. I just don't see Japan having any real interest in type of military-themed programming unless it is a fantasy or science fiction in the future. I just don't see that happening with Sentai.
And and despite all the apprehension that I've expressed about a military Sentai or military Power Rangers, I wouldn't mind seeing some military aesthetic. I wouldn't mind seeing a tank for a mecha, or say a battleship, or
absolutely. I mean, we have the Battlefleet Megazord. We have the Zords from RPM, Helicopter, and Jet. There's nothing wrong with using military vehicles and all that. But again, it's just the overall theme and aesthetic. And the thing is, if Sentai does go that way, where they do the full-on army kind of thing, it's very difficult for Saban to try to adapt that without losing... excuse me, to adapt it without the military theme. But then again, we know they can skip a Sentai now, so who knows?
Well, it would depend on what came before and after if they were going to do that.
Very true, very true. So, Raptor, I think we've kind of made our points right here. You know, it's very obvious we're both kind of against it. I would have to admit that I'm very impassionedly against it, and, you know, look at my junior film for evidence of that. But, I mean,
well, I dislike a recruitment commercial in disguise as much as you do. So
yeah, I mean, again, that's why I don't like American Sniper, and that's the third time I mentioned that. But Raptor, what final thoughts do you just want to go ahead and say about just the overall question or presence of a military within Power Rangers or Sentai?
Well, I don't want to see a stealth recruitment commercial, but I wouldn't mind seeing some military themed aesthetics.
Yeah, I mean,
as long as
I still want a tank Zord. I admit I do want a tank Zord.
As long as we're not having dancers coming out and saying "Even et Niage."
I hope our fans get that. I really do, because that's actually one of my favorite episodes. So, okay. Well, Raptor, I want to thank you for joining me on this topic. I know it's kind of a loaded topic. It's a heated topic. I look forward to the comments that we will be getting for this video, but I think we've kept it pretty neutral. Well, not neutral, but mellow.
I'm waiting for someone to do the Navy SEAL tough guy meme in the comments.
Yes, we will see. But in any case, Raptor, I want to thank you for joining me here tonight. It's always a pleasure to talk with you about these topics.
Oh yeah, I love dropping by when I can.
All right. Well, Raptor, thank you again. Patrons, thank you for listening to us. Have a good evening. And the tavern is now closed.